My mother was an immigrant, and she arrived in the United States in 1952. Growing up, my mother never talked about her childhood much. As a young child, I never thought about why she didn't want to talk about it. As I got older and took history classes in school, I learned about that time and place where she grew up. And to me anyway, I thought maybe she didn't want to talk about it. My maternal grandmother was born in 1893, and she died in 1993, just 6 months shy of her 100th birthday. At some point, my sister decided that it would be a good idea to interview my mother and grandmother. Only they could tell their story. My grandmother was pretty lucid until her death, but she had lost some of the details of the events that occurred earlier in her life. So my sister interviewed them together, and she recorded the conversation. My mother died in 2009, and I didn't listen to the interviews until after her death. I have questions now that no one has the answers to, so I wish I had listened to the interviews earlier so I could talk to her. What I will be sharing with you are some of the details of those interviews. I apologize in advance for anyone who isn't a history buff, but I have to include some history in order for you to understand the totality of the events. I am not a history buff, but naturally this time period holds a personal interest for me. So you will be getting some history because there is no other way to tell her story without it, and it will help fill in some of the gaps that remained from the interviews. My mother was born in 1930 in East Prussia in a town called Goldschmiede, about 8 to 10 kilometers northeast of Königsberg. She lived there with my grandfather, my grandmother, and 3 of her siblings. One sister was married, and one brother was already in the military. The interviews begin by discussing who lived at home and what life was like in East Prussia during World War II. Now here comes the history part. Are you ready? I won't go way back to the Teutonic Knights. I'll keep the history to just before my mother's story begins. East Prussia was a province of the Kingdom of Prussia from 1773 to 1829, and again from 1878, and was part of the German Empire from 1871. Following World War I, it was part of the Weimar Republic's Free State of Prussia. Geographically, East Prussia was isolated from the rest of the German Empire by the Polish corridor, the Baltic Sea on the north, Lithuania on the east, and by Poland and the Free City of Danzig on the south and west. Warsaw was situated very close to East Prussia, while Berlin was 240 miles away. The Polish industrial districts were 200 miles closer to East Prussia than the German industrial region of Westphalia. So geographically as well as economically, Poland and East Prussia formed a whole. When Hitler came into power in 1939, the Prussian Constitution was set aside, the legislature was abolished, opposition politicians were persecuted, and newspapers were banned. The access to the Baltic Sea and the food production of East Prussia made it an important area for the German war machine. But because of its isolation from the rest of Germany, it lacked the industrialization that was seen in the rest of Germany. So Erich Koch, who headed the East Prussian Nazi Party, created the Erich Koch Plan, which brought emergency relief programs for agricultural land improvement projects and road construction. Prior to this, there was a lot of unemployment in East Prussia, and the wages were the lowest in Germany. Now, back to my mother's story. My mother's family lived in an apartment complex in Goldschmiede that housed 26 families. My grandmother, grandfather, and one of my aunts worked at a nearby military airport. My sister asked my mother and grandmother what the situation was like in East Prussia after Hitler came into power and the war started. Like many people, we wanted to know what the general civilian population thought of Hitler and the war. As I mentioned during the history lesson, there was a lot of unemployment in East Prussia, and the wages were low. Here's what my mother shared.
From what I can remember is that that jobs were kind of bad, and the economy, I think, was kind of bad. Mm-hmm. And Hitler took over, and he created jobs.
Right.
People got jobs. He gave the people that had a lot of kids Kindergeld. For each child, they got so and so many marks, Kindergeld.
Oh.
In other words, he wanted people to have more kids. Okay, so he had something cooking already, probably.
Sure.
You heard my mother talk about Kindergeld. As you might surmise, this was a monthly stipend to families for each child they had. But you can't mistake this as an economic stimulus like what we experienced with COVID. No, Hitler wanted to grow Germany, and part of the way you grow Germany was to grow in numbers. But not just any growth. Growth of people with good blood. Young people were incentivized to get married and start families by being given marriage loans. For each child that was born, 1/4 of the debt was erased. So if you had 4 children, all of your debt was erased. They even gave medals to the women who produced the most children. Bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8. Of course, people didn't realize the purpose behind this at first. All they knew was that the economy was better and people with families were getting more economic incentives. My mother shares more about life during the war while in Goldschmiede. Bombing by the Soviets and the RAF became more pronounced in the 1940s. She said at first they would go into the cellar of the apartment building, but when the bombing increased, that wasn't safe enough. So a bomb shelter was built in a field away from the house. Königsberg was often the target, and it was devastated by the bombing. My mother says that, of course, the military airport near their home, where their mother and father worked, was constantly busy with planes taking off for missions. The air raids were the first thing my mother remembers about life being different. They each packed a bag to take with them to the shelter. My sister asked what they packed in their suitcases. My mother said my grandmother packed all their important documents just in case the apartment was destroyed. My mother said they packed clothing, and then my sister asked for more clarification.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, what each of you would take down there with you. Did you have favorite toys or books or anything like that?
We didn't have any toys or books.
Just what was most important?
Yeah, we were glad when we hadn't clothes to wear and food to eat. We didn't have any toys.
Before going to bed, they laid their clothes out so that they were easy to find and put on in the dark, since once the sirens began, all lights had to be extinguished. The big question, of course, was what my mother knew about the treatment of the Jewish people during the war. When the war started, she was 9, and she said she and her friends became aware when some students were wearing Jewish stars on their clothes, but they didn't know the significance of it. They knew that they were instructed to make fun of the Jewish children, and they did. It wasn't until the war was over and she was older that she understood the significance of it and how to deal with the guilt of making fun of Jewish children. At school, the girls were asked to join the Bund Deutsche Mädel, the BDM, or the League of German Girls. This was the girls' wing of the Nazi Party youth movement, the Hitler Youth. It was the only legal female youth organization allowed in Nazi Germany. There were 2 sections of the league, the Jungmädelbund, Young Girls League, for ages 10 to 14, and the league proper for girls aged 14 to 18. Membership in the league was compulsory, so they weren't really asking you to join. You were required to join. At first, my mother thought it was fun. There were activities like sports, which she previously had never been involved in, and they took the girls on outings, which my mother thought was great.
They even had some outings, That's the only time I ever got to go to the Baltic Sea, to the beach on the Baltic Sea. Other than that, we were, very poor, and we didn't get to go on any outings.
The superintendent of my mother's school was a big Nazi Party leader who really pushed the Hitler Youth movement in the school. My grandparents were not enamored with Hitler and did not join the National Socialist German Workers' Party. However, the headmaster of my mother's school was a fanatical party member, and he wore his uniform to school. And he targeted my mother and her siblings.
And I know because Omi and Opa didn't join the Nationalsozialistische Party, he kind of picked on us all the time. Either I had my dresses too short or I got an extra whipping on my hands or something. Oh, yeah. He really picked on us.
So anybody that didn't join, wasn't part of the party, he kind of was prejudiced against.
Right.
As you can tell, my grandparents did not have a lot of money, but they always managed to have a roof over their heads and food on the table. Although they lived in an apartment, my grandmother leased land where she planted potatoes. She didn't have money to pay for the lease on the land, so she bartered by working in the fields of the people who owned the land. The amount of land one leased would determine how long they had to work in the owner's fields. She also raised a few chickens and a couple of pigs on the leased land. They did receive ration cards, and the amounts of goods they received were not measured in pounds. They might receive half a cup of sugar or 1 cup of flour. They could not go out and buy clothing or shoes. They had to get a permit to obtain such items, and they had to justify the reason they needed it. In school, students learned how to darn socks, which were sent to the soldiers. They were also taught how to recognize and pick herbs for tea, which were dried in the school attic and sent to the soldiers. In late 1944, my mother recalls that the sound of shooting was getting closer to their town. German soldiers who had been absent from the area were being pushed back from Poland and Russia into East Prussia. That was the beginning of the East Prussian offensive. Again, a little background history. The first East Prussian offensive occurred in October 1944. The Soviet forces moved about 35 miles into the east-northern part of Poland, but they had a lot of casualties. So they paused the offensive for a while until they could gather more reserves. It was likely the first offensive which caused the alarm with my grandparents and made them and some of their neighbors decide to leave. So they loaded a child's sled with some clothing and food, bacon, bread, schmaltz, which is fat. By this time, my mother's older sister had gotten married and was living in Bavaria. The goal was to get to her home and stay with her. That was about 1,300 kilometers or over 800 miles away. They obviously could not do that on foot, so they needed to find a way to get there. But the biggest priority was just to get out of East Prussia ahead of the Red Army. This was December 1944. Operation Hannibal, the evacuation of civilians and military out of East Prussia, was initiated due to the fear of the Red Army advances during the East Prussian offensive. Remember, the first offensive occurred in October, but it had to be halted. The evacuation, called Operation Hannibal, was supposed to have started months earlier, but Hitler stalled on the evacuation, believing it to be a sign of weakness. The official evacuation didn't begin until January 20th. However, many civilians, like my mother's family, didn't wait for the official push for evacuation, and they took to the roads on their own. As my mother stated, they could hear the fighting getting closer, and there were rumors of Soviet atrocities against Germans in the areas already under Soviet control. Initially, Erich Koch, the district leader of East Prussia, forbade civilians to evacuate and ordered that anyone trying to flee should be instantly shot. Any preparations to leave made by civilians was treated as defeatism. Unsurprisingly, Koch and many other Nazi functionaries were among the first to flee East Prussia. The winter of 1944-1945 was particularly brutal. Almost all motorized vehicles had been seized by the German army, so civilians had only carts and wagons, or like my mother's family, a child's sled to hold all their possessions. They had to walk, but they weren't allowed to walk on the roads. Those had to remain open for the evacuation of soldiers. Many families in my mother's apartment building left at the same time. In particular, my mother recalls traveling with a family named Resnick. Another family, the Pelzers, had more money and they were able to leave in a wagon. First, they headed to the Baltic Seas, where they believed they could get on a ship out of East Prussia. But the temperature was so cold and it was snowing, so my mother's group decided to head back towards Goldschmiede and to the train station in the hopes of catching a train out of the area. But once they got there, no trains ever came. So they started walking again towards Danzig and the Baltic Sea, about 100 miles away. Between the weather and the large mass of people, it was slow going. And then planes would come and strafe the people, which included civilians and soldiers. When they heard the planes, they ran towards the trees, if there were some nearby that they could hide in, or they would just throw themselves on the ground. But with all the snow on the ground, they were easy to see. My mother, then 14 years old, recalls seeing a soldier who was killed.
And then we start walking. That's right. First we walked, and then the bombs came down, and killed the guy over there. Was it you who saw, saw him laying there? Yeah, the head with the helmet. The helmet was here, the head with the helmet was here, and his body was over the other place. And that was from the wires, because the machine guns hit the wires, the electric wires or telephone wires, and the wire I hear the wires whistling, and it just cut the guy's head off.
As they walked, they would try to find abandoned homes where they could stay overnight, packed in many families and soldiers as could fit in the space in order to get out of the cold. There was often no electricity, but the walls helped keep out some of the bitter cold. My mother recalls that one of the soldiers made aggressive sexual advances on one of her friends until other people in the house intervened. When they finally got to the Baltic Sea, they reached an area on the shoreline called Frischeshof. Out from Frischeshof is a sand spit or small peninsula called Frisches Nährung, and in between is a lagoon. The sand spit separates the lagoon from the Danzig Bay and the Baltic Sea. Their ultimate destination was Gotenhafen, a port town where they were to meet with ships that were evacuating soldiers and civilians. To get to Gotenhafen, they had to meet up with a small ship which would take them from Frisches Nährung to Gotenhafen. And to get to Frisches Nährung, they would have to first cross the lagoon, which at that time of the year was frozen solid. The lagoon was also very much out in the open, without any windbreak from the freezing wind and without any tree cover to run under in case of an air attack. The long procession of people with their wagons and sleds proceeded across the lagoon, sometimes coming under fire. The strafing fire from the bullets would pierce the ice in some places, causing people to fall into the freezing water. Finally reaching the area of Frisches Nährung, they boarded a boat which took them to Gotenhafen. In Gotenhafen, they found shelter in an abandoned house with about 50 other people, where they remained for several weeks because they couldn't get out. The Red Cross had set up tents where people could get some watered-down soup, and my mother scattered around the area for potatoes and fish and was usually able to bring something for the family every day. While they were there, they met up with their neighbors, the Pelzers, who had arrived ahead of them. After being in Gotenhafen for several weeks, on January 25th, a large ocean liner started boarding civilians to evacuate them. Of course, my mother and her family and thousands of other people hoped that they would get on the ship because the Red Army was getting closer and closer. By January 29th, the official count of people on board the ocean liner was 7,956, but it's believed at least another 2,000 people got on board after the official registration stopped. My mother and her family were turned away, and they were upset that after waiting so many weeks, they still hadn't gotten out, and they didn't know when or if they would. But their neighbors, the Peltzers, were excited to have been able to get on board the ship. The name of the ship was the Wilhelm Gustloff. After 12 noon on January 30th, the Gustloff left the harbor. It was supposed to be part of a larger convoy, but two ships had mechanical problems and they had to turn back. The Gustloff was therefore only accompanied by one torpedo boat. The captain of the ship was also afraid of mechanical problems and decided to travel no faster than 12 knots or 14 miles an hour. In order to reduce the likelihood of attack by Soviet submarines, it was recommended that they travel at 15 knots. But the captain ignored that advice, and also the advice of his first officer, who said that if they were going to travel that slowly, they should hug the coastline. However, the captain wanted to go out to deeper water to be clear of mines. At around 6 p.m., the captain received a warning that there was a minesweeper convoy headed their way, so he turned on the ship's navigation lights to prevent a collision. The ship never encountered a minesweeper convoy, but its lights were spotted by a Soviet submarine at around 7 p.m. At 9:16 p.m., the Gustloff was hit by 3 torpedoes and proceeded to sink over the course of 1 hour. The ship was carrying an estimated 10,000 people, with lifeboats and rafts for only 5,000 people. In the end, only 1,239 people could be registered as survivors. The news got back to my mother's family, and they were at a loss for words at this incredibly close call and also the loss of their neighbors, the Peltzers. After the loss of the Gustloff, they were finally able to get on a freight train out of Gotenhofen. But part way in their journey, in the middle of nowhere, the engine uncoupled from the train and left the rest of the train and the people aboard stranded. They had no idea where they were or why they were left behind. A while later, the engine returned and took them back to Gotenhofen, so they had gotten nowhere. Finally, they heard that a train was going to arrive and take people to Berlin. By this time, they were having a hard time believing anything was going to happen. But the train did arrive, and when it did, the people rushed the train to try and get on board. My mother and her younger sister quickly pushed their way onto the train, but my grandmother was still on the platform. They hollered and hollered for her, and she was finally able to push her way through the throng, get on the train, and find my mother and aunt. There were more people on the train than there was room to accommodate everyone.
But there was more people than room in that train, believe me. And when that train stopped, those people just went in there like animals. Mm-hmm. And she was still outside, so I hollered, to Inge, and I was in the train, and she was still outside, so I hollered, and she squeezed through, so we all ended up in the train. But we had barely enough room to stand on 1 foot, much less on 2 feet.
Once they arrived in Berlin, they were relieved to find that the trains were still on a schedule and they were able to secure passage to Bavaria. It was February 3rd, 1945, a clear day, warmer than what they had been enduring up in East Prussia. They felt like they could relax a little. A short time before that day, Lieutenant General James H. Jimmy Doolittle, the commander of the U.S. 8th Air Force, was given the battle order for a mission to be flown on February 3rd, 1945, to attack Berlin. This offensive was World War II's most extensive bombing mission. Doolittle dispatched 1,437 heavy bombers and 948 fighters. Takeoff was around 8 a.m. One airman later wrote, "The number of bombers was something beyond the imagination." The parade of Allied bombers flying towards Berlin stretched 360 miles, and it took 90 minutes for the formation to pass over the German capital. My mother's train had left Berlin just a short time before the bombers arrived, and they could see them flying overhead as they traveled on to Bavaria.
And when we left Berlin was just ready to have an air raid. And we saw the machine guns firing and the Berlin lighting up, like they do in an air raid. Berlin looked pretty lit up to us.
They heard that the night before they arrived in Augsburg, it had also been bombed, so they weren't sure if my mother's older sister was okay or if their home had been bombed. They arrived in the train station at Augsburg and the streetcars had stopped running. Their final destination was Stadtbergen, which was 3 miles away, so they had to walk the final distance. On the walk to Stadtbergen, they encountered a drunk man who tried to grab my grandmother and make her go with him. A soldier stepped in and got rid of the guy and then walked with them until they reached their destination. The war and air raids continued until April 1945, when American troops arrived in Augsburg. When they heard that the American troops were coming, there was a lot of fear. They hid in basements, expecting gunfire and chaos. But there was nothing. They finally ventured out and found the American troops giving chocolate and gum to the children, things that they hadn't seen for a very long time. Around the same time that my mother's family left Godenhofen for Berlin, the Red Army had surrounded Königsberg and its remaining 200,000 civilians were trapped inside. The population of East Prussia was about 2.5 million people before the war. About 500,000 died during the war. About 311,000 died during the evacuation and the post-war expulsion of Germans. Approximately 1.2 million managed to escape to western parts of Germany. My mother was never able to go back to school. In Germany at that time, school ended when you were 14, unless you paid to go to higher education. She was already 14, so her schooling was done. She started working at various jobs. One job was at a butcher shop that had been turned into a canteen to serve meals to soldiers. She said her shift always started after breakfast, and she was able to bring home used coffee grounds and pancake mix. They were still on rations, so my grandmother and the others would eagerly be waiting for my mom to return from the canteen to see what she had brought. My grandmother would reuse the coffee grounds to make coffee, and she made cake from the pancake mix. And this is a trait I think I got from my mother.
Every time we was waiting, Ellie and Gustav was there too,
Yeah.
We was waiting when she came with the coffee ground and we made some coffee. We cooked that up and made some coffee.
Made some over again, huh?
Yeah.
I can survive, boy. I'm a scrounger.
Once my mother turned 18, she was able to work for American soldiers as a housekeeper, and this is where she learned to speak English. My mother learned about the Displaced Persons Act for the resettlement of Europeans who were displaced because of the war. And the more they thought about it, the better immigrating to the United States sounded.
Sounded like honey was flowing from the trees in America.
In order to be approved, you had to be cleared medically, and you had to have a sponsor. The Church World Service was my mother's sponsor, and they worked with American citizens who would provide a job and housing for the person. Church World Service paid for the passage on the ship for my mother, father, and my 2 brothers. The cost of transportation from Ellis Island to their housing was paid by the person supplying the housing and the job. And from the wages they earned from that landlord, they paid off the cost of the transportation. My grandmother and grandfather were also sponsored by World Church Service, but with a different citizen offering them housing and a job. On the ship from Europe to New York, the men were separated from the women and children. So my mother was left with the task of tending to my 2 young brothers, and at the same time, she was pregnant with my sister. I can't imagine how difficult that passage across the Atlantic was for her. The person who offered my mother and father housing and a job was a farmer in Colorado. So he paid for their tickets from New York to Colorado, and part of the agreement was that they would stay for a year or until they had paid for the cost of the train tickets. When they arrived at the farm, he showed them to their quote-unquote housing. It was a chicken coop that had barely been cleaned out. You could see the light shining in from the roof. They turned down the housing, and the farmer was kind of taken aback that they did that.
He said, well, we thought that you would be satisfied with anything.
So they found alternate housing 2 miles up the road from the farmer and paid him back within 3 months. Then they made a connection with another displaced person in Denver who helped them find a place to live in a fourplex just north of Denver. To my mother, it felt luxurious. It had 2 bedrooms, a true living room, a kitchen, an indoor bathroom, and plumbing. My father got a job with the Union Pacific Railroad and traveled back and forth from Denver to Chicago, so he was out of town for 2 days at a time. In November of 1952, my dad returned home from work on a Sunday morning, and on Sunday afternoon, my sister was born. He had to leave again on the following Tuesday, since they couldn't afford for him to miss any work. So by Tuesday, my mother was up, washing diapers, and taking care of 3 children. She didn't have anyone around to help her. She would have to walk up the street to the grocery store and try to figure out how to feed her little family.
I remember walking up to Miller's Supermarket. There used to be a Miller's Supermarket on York Street. And I figured out, well, I got about $3. What can I get for $3? I need this and this and this. And I figured out the pound of coffee is 39 cents and a 5-pound bag of flour. As long as you have flour, eggs, and milk, you could do quite a few things. A bag of flour you could get for 29 cents, a 5-pound bag of flour. Canned milk you could get 8 for $1 sometimes. A lot of times, right, Dad? Yeah. And boy, you made $3 go a long way. Ground beef you could get maybe 29 cents a pound. You can do a lot of things with ground beef.
My mother said it took her about 3 years to become acclimated to the United States and feel like they had made the right decision. My father worked various jobs, and I think it was in the early 1960s that they bought their first home. The honey may not have been flowing from the trees, but they did pretty well for themselves. During their escape from the Red Army, I feel like there were so many incidents that could have gone a different way, and I would have never existed. Instead, through luck and grit, my parents made a life for themselves and for us. I think I get a lot of my determination to push forward no matter what from my mother. And even if I never learned how to manage money from her, I learned how to scrap and scrounge, as she did, and to be grateful for whatever I had. Love you, Mom. Happy belated Mother's Day.